Okay, so thank you so much for this transatlantic panel. So, I'm really excited for this one because, yeah, like it's like in the transatlantic slave culture, obviously the fable is very important. And then like we have a very exciting like three speakers today. So first paper is by Dr. Rachel. How do you pronounce your name?
Pasierowska.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Rachael Pasierowska is assistant professor in history at Lincoln University. And then she is and historically Black college and universities, HBCU, in Missouri. Her research looks at enslaved persons' identity, formations, and cultural connections in African American slavery through the transatlantic slave trade and animals. And her work is also very transnational and also because it includes interaction between Africans, Europeans, and indigenous Americans in Brazil, Cuba, and the US South. Now, it's an abbreviated version of her bio, so please visit the document to see the full details. Okay, shall I share the? Would you like to share yours? Yeah.
Yes, I can share mine. Thank you. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So thank you for the lovely introduction. That takes away a lot of the work from me. So I very much appreciate that. My name is Dr. Rachael Pasierowska, and I hold a dual PhD from Rice University in Texas, and also the Universidade Estadual de Campinas, which is in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. Right now, I'm working at Lincoln University, which is in Missouri, and so it's just after around 7 a.m. here. But I'm feeling good to go, and it's nice to see some people from the homeland and to hear some home accents. So my presentation today is entitled Bre'r, Rabbit, and Blue Fox in African American Storytelling, as Education of Enslaved Children in the Antebellum U.S. South to Linguistic Approaches in Pedagogy Today. And I finish off with a couple of possible questions for discussion. In particular, it would be very exciting for me to learn how people teach some of the points that I'm going to talk about in different countries. Looking at my presentation outline, I'm going to begin with a very brief introduction to the Bre'r Rabbit stories for the purposes of time. I want to look at links to Africa, African roots, and I'm going to focus a lot on education. So my third point is looking at stories and education during slavery. Number 4, reproduction of Bre'r Rabbit stories through the 19th to the 20th centuries. 5th, teaching Bre'r Rabbit stories in the 20th century. And then I have some closing remarks. So looking at the introduction to the Bre'r Rabbit stories. These stories were typically passed down through generations. And this is very important when we look at time, and I will allude to this a little bit later. Many of these interviews were collected by several people across the United States. I will also refer to this later on some of the biases. One of the collectors, Joe Chandler Harris, was white, and this is presented or presents us as historians with a very large bias and how we use these sources. Many of the sources that I have are from the Works Progress Administration interviews. And these interviews, what is interesting about them is one of the primary critiques is looking at the younger age at which the interviewees experienced slavery. And when we're looking at stories, this can actually act as a positive, especially when we look at memory and arguments with respect to people in older age having clearer memories of childhood. The stories were often directed to children's ears, and they focus on central protagonists, predominantly Bre'r Rabbit, but also other characters. Bre'r Rabbit is sometimes referred to as Boo Rabbit, Brother Rabbit, and Bre'r Rabbit. And the stories incorporate animals and draw upon typical characteristics of certain animals. And a lot of my research over here in the US looks at why different peoples from across the Atlantic world placed similar characteristics onto animals. And one thing about the rabbit I'll look at later is speed and such. There's just a quick slide on African roots. So trickster stories have existed, have a very, very long history. We see them in European, African, Indigenous American cultures. And I note these purely because these are the areas, some of the areas that I focus on. We see that of around 220 stories, around half of these hold African roots, predominantly from West Africa, but also from Central West Africa. There are a lot of connections that come from the Açores region around Rio de Janeiro in Brazil that also use similar examples of rabbits as tricksters. Zobel the hare, you can see in the bottom left image, a very, very bright, attractive image. You can, this book is on sale in countries across Africa. It's also on sale in the US, on Amazon. But we see, and I'm part of the school of scholars who argue this, that Zobel the hare came across as part of the transatlantic slave trade and diaspora. Here on the right, you can see an image from the late 19th century that also looks at the character Bre'r Rabbit. So I really want to focus a lot of this presentation on education. I want to look at the example of education of enslaved children during slavery times. Those of you who might be familiar with my research will know that I look a lot at the formations of childhood identity formation. As mentioned, these stories were often directed to children's ears. Covert messages and also overt messages were contained in these stories through representations of the plantation society, and what I would argue as a microcosm. When we look deeper at plantation societies in the US, and I'll only focus on the US for the purpose of this presentation, we see in the 1700s, even into the very early 1800s, Indigenous Americans enslaved alongside indentured servants from Europe and enslaved Africans, predominantly from Africa as first generation. At the same time, during this time period, especially in the 1700s, a lot of enslaved persons to the United States came from Jamaica. So what a lot of scholars would argue, and I'm part of this camp as well, is how these stories look at learning of servile statuses during slavery for children. They talk of survival stories and resistance, perseverance and autonomy. I want to push that further. For me, we also see survival stories and resistance by people holding on to these tales. Older arguments, as some of you might be familiar with, were that focused around, especially until the 1960s, that the transatlantic slave trade, that transatlantic voyage across the North Atlantic was so devastatingly traumatic for enslaved Africans that they forgot their identities, large parts of their identities. Of course, now we know that it's not true, but I feel it's still important to look at. Now, when you look at the stories in the United States, something that is very important in this context is how change over time takes place. By this, I mean, in 1808, the United States abolishes the transatlantic slave trade, 1 year after England. However, the United States does not abolish slavery until Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. I just always feel that I need to make an aside here that enslaved persons, people of African descent, continue to remain in servile statuses, in indigenous American territories. And I just think that's a big point for me to make. That's just my personal opinion, that it's important to share that when I say slavery was abolished and enslaved persons of African descent were freed in 1865. It didn't apply to everybody in the country. When I look at change over time or continuation over time, we see, for instance, how these stories were passed down. We know that the illegal slave trade continued and that enslaved Africans did continue to arrive in the United States. However, this was on a much, much smaller scale. When we look at this as being relatable to a child audience, it also brings into consideration who might have been the storyteller. We see a lot of links back to West African, in particular, storytelling cultural practices in relation to the education of children and other members of the community. And I'm very much focusing here on slavery on a slave plantation. So I want to give an example as a short case study, just to illustrate how I look at the stories within my work and how I work with these stories to try and better understand different parts of enslaved persons' lives, identities, and especially among children, identity formation. We see frequent appearances of Bre'r Possum. In one story, he loses all of his hair on his tail in a skirmish with a bear. You can see here in the image on the right, there's a fluffy possum, and he has this bald tail that sometimes to me looks a little bit like an armadillo tail. In another story, he ends up in the fireplace, he's in a cooking pot after being tricked by the other animals. He's getting ready to become dinner. And some of these stories, I know those who will be speaking about Anansi, they're similar stories. Anansi tricking others into a cooking pot or being tied to a piece of wood or something so that he's not able to escape. So when we look at this, we see immediately that Bre'r Possum is a character who is presented as lacking intelligence, easy to fool, easy to capture in a sense. I want to look at this then further and how it links to my research. What we see here in this instance is a story about Bre'r Possum. A lot of people would argue, and I myself are of this school, that Bre'r Rabbit and sometimes other characters in the Bre'r Rabbit stories represent enslaved persons. They look at this fight toward independence, autonomy, self-expression, and such. What I look at in my research is how many enslaved families, and this brings in arguments of masculinity, worked very hard to supplement their diets. Now, when the Works Progress Administration interviews took place in the 1930s, a lot of people were experiencing the Great Depression. A lot of people, former enslaved persons, were struggling greatly from hunger. So a lot of these stories tell us about great hunger in the contemporary period during the Great Depression when these interviews were taking place. At the same time, we hear a lot of stories about eating possums on a Sunday, for instance, that their parents might have cooked up, the mother, older siblings, aunts, grandmothers had cooked up with roasted sweet potatoes, pot liquor, so kind of a stock, a broth, and how these were some of the greatest memories that they have of food during this time period. When we see bringing together of communities and such. Now, possums are very, very high in protein as a protein source. There seems to be a plethora of possums when I was living in Texas. Also here in Missouri, it's quite common to see possums, even though they're more nocturnal. They reproduce at quite a quick rate. And just randomly, if you ever Google a picture of a possum, they have a reputation of being pretty ugly. But if you Google a picture of them with the little babies hanging on their back, I think you can be convinced that they're very, very sweet. In the Works Progress Administration interviews, we see a lot of vocabulary about treeing an opossum. So treeing a possum and such. When we look at this, one way in which enslaved persons treed these possums to eat and such was by rearing and training dogs, which were called possum dogs, possum hounds and such. Now, this could go into another conversation about how we see a juxtaposition here between slaveholders and overseers using dogs to chase enslaved persons. I'm not going to go into that aspect of research today. What I want to focus on is how enslaved persons often shared their own dogs. They spent a lot of time training their dogs to hunt for possums. And so the notion of treeing a possum brought in various members of a male community, from little children who might scale up these trees to collect the possums who had been chased into the trees by dogs, net them and such. So I want to look at the reproduction of these stories through the 19th to the 20th centuries. So Joel Chandler Harris created a collection known as Uncle Remus stories. Now, Harris spent time with enslaved persons, learning songs, stories, and dialects until emancipation. It's really important when I'm teaching this and when I'm writing about this to be very, very upfront and acknowledge that Joel Chandler Harris was a white person. He was working not as an overseer, he was not a slaveholder, he wasn't a very wealthy person. He worked as an editorial assistant for a number of newspapers. Arguably, the characters were based on people in Harris's life, and he creates or he draws upon stories that include a character named Uncle Remus. This term in itself has a lot of criticisms. Even when you look at the interviews in the 1930s, a lot of the people who were being interviewed were referred to as auntie, uncle, and such. And there's been a lot of criticism toward that, about not naming people, for instance, by just their first names, but calling them uncle, for instance, as opposed to, for instance, Mr. Remus. Uncle Remus, then, using Joel Chandler Harris's terms, was a narrator. He's portrayed as an elderly former enslaved man working for former slaveholders. This is very, very important. When we see the movie portrays this in an instance in the time of slavery. The stories are reproduced during the Reconstruction, or they're set, in the Reconstruction period. They're also, for the majority, written by Joel Chandler Harris in the Reconstruction period. And this is from the end of the Civil War, from 1865 until 1877. Now, I'm going to read through this citation. It's one that when I'm teaching, I like to focus on a lot. It's a very, very rich citation. And this is included in one of the preludes to Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus stories. I cite, "My purpose has been to preserve the legends themselves in their original simplicity and to wed them permanently to the quaint dialect, through the medium of which they have become a part of the domestic history of every Southern family. And I have endeavored to give to the whole a genuine flavor of the old plantation." I'm just going to draw on a couple of things here, and things that I look at when I'm teaching. We see words such as original simplicity, legends, the quaint dialect. They have become a part of the domestic history of every Southern family. And when we're looking at every Southern family, is he writing for a white audience? Is he writing for all audiences who are reading these across the United States? And then finally, I've endeavored to give to the whole a genuine flavor of the old plantation. And a massive critique, and this also comes through when I look briefly at the Disney movie, The Song of the South, is that this is a very, very distorted view of times under slavery. So moving into Walt Disney's The Song of the South, I'm not sure how many people have seen this. It would be very, very interesting to see, maybe to discuss it in the Q&A section. But it was based on the works by Joel Chandler Harris. It was released in 1946. It's a little bit of the style of Mary Poppins in the sense that it has, we see live action alongside the sort of small characters, these little animals and such, working along together and in conversation with each other. It portrayed, as I mentioned, this idyllic Southern plantation life. But as I mentioned, it was set during the Reconstruction period. Immediately after the film is released, and of course this is during times of segregation, the NAACP published articles on this and reports about how the movie has distorted facts and portrays a very dangerously glorified picture of slavery. Uncle Remus is presented as being non-threatening to white audiences, and Joel Chandler Harris looks at this in his work. The movie was removed from airing in the United States and then later worldwide in the early 2000s. I remember watching this when I was a child. We had a VHS. I know it's a historical document now in itself, but I remember watching this. I called it the Zippity-Doo-Dah movie. That's all I can say from my memories as a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old about the film, but I wanted to watch the Zippity-Doo-Dah movie. I had no idea to what it was referring. I didn't remember that, and I had no context from a British audience, from growing up in Britain, what it might have meant. Would I have understood it at that age? That's another question for discussion. So now looking at the 21st century, and this looks more at my work.
Rachel, could you wrap up in like 5 minutes, within 5 minutes?
Oh yes, I'm done in 1 minute. I should be.
Great.
Thank you. So we see the importance of biases in the stories and in the Works Progress Administration interviews. Some of these biases, a large amount, 3/4 of these interviews were collected by white interviewers. A lot of these interviewers had no experience in oral history in collecting interviews. What also is important are the following 3 variables: student body, geographical regions across the United States, and generational histories of students. And note that I have not taught these stories in the United Kingdom. I have only taught these stories in a US setting, as an English person, a British person as well at that. So when we're looking at student body, geographical regions, and generational histories of students, it is very important to note that every school in the United States have different student bodies, have different identities. An example would be, I just moved from the University of Iowa. My audience was very, very white and rural. A lot of people did not have direct histories tied to slavery. They were unfamiliar with these stories and slavery in general. Right now, where I've just started work, I'm at a historically Black school. It was founded in 1866, and it was a school that was founded by African Americans, and it was a school aimed at educating former enslaved persons. So I'm also navigating the world right now of my new location in how to teach these stories and looking at people's generational histories who have experienced possibly listening to these stories as they've been passed down. So in conclusion, I would be very interested to hear how people relate to these stories, teach these stories in different countries, and also their experiences with stories and looking at childhood education and such. So thank you for your time. I know I ran over 1 minute. I apologize, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very interesting. So next speaker is Emily Zobel Marshall, and she is a professor in cultural studies at the Leeds Beckett Universities, and she is an expert on the trickster figure in folklore, oral cultures, and literature of the African diasporas. And then she has a book each on the two trickster figures featured in this panel. So one of the books, Anansi's Journey, a short story of Jamaican cultural resistance, 2012, and the American Trickster, Trauma, Tradition, and Bre'r Rabbit, 2019. Okay, thank you. Emily, over to you. Shall I share the screen or?
Hi, yes, I'm having a little bit of trouble. Sometimes I'm to share the slides. So would you be able to share the slides?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you.
So let me see. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and it's wonderful to be here. I will try and keep to time, but I often try and pack a little too much in. So if there's anything that you feel that I have kind of rushed over and you'd like to hear more about, we can take that up in the Q&A. So my presentation is going to be about the Anansi trickster figure, but I'm also going to touch on Bre'r Rabbit. And so it's wonderful to see Rachel take up the Bre'r Rabbit story in her last presentation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I've written 2 books about the trickster figure. I've been absolutely fascinated by the trickster from a very young age, when my mother used to read me Anansi stories and tell me Anansi stories. My mother was from the French Caribbean. My first book, Anansi's Journey, looks at Anansi as a figure of resistance and survival in the enslaved populations in Jamaica. I was really interested in how these stories that originated in West Africa were used as tools or strategies to outmaneuver and undermine the plantation system, and also how they evolved in the contemporary period. The second book I've written, American Trickster, looks at Bre'r Rabbit, and as you'll see, Bre'r Rabbit has a very different cultural trajectory to Anansi. While Anansi is still celebrated as a resistance figure in Jamaica and across the Caribbean, the Bre'r Rabbit trickster figure, as we've touched upon in Rachel's presentation, has been in many ways co-opted by a white audience and used in a rather problematic way to stereotype Black cultural forms. Next slide. The real inspiration behind my work is rooted in my grandfather's work. My grandfather is called Joseph Zobel, and he grew up cutting cane in the plantations of Martinique. Martinique was a French colony back then. He narrowly escaped working all his life in the plantations by being sent to school, and his grandmother insisted on cutting cane in the fields and not allowing him to cut cane, so he was able to gain an education. In his 20s, he wrote a book called Black Shack Alley, La Rue Cazenegre, which has now become a Penguin classic, which outlines history, his own history, his own life, so it's semi-autobiographical. And in that story, he also talks about how a storyteller, Monsieur Meduse, helped him as a young boy to reconnect with Africa and to reconnect with an understanding of his history. So for me, growing up with this book, and it's also been made into a film, I was very aware that there was a more sort of potent power to storytelling than I might initially have seen. So that was a real source of inspiration for me in my obsession with folklore and a trickster figure. Next slide. First, I'm going to touch on the roots of the Anansi stories. Now, my book traces the Anansi figure. So Anansi, I'm sure you all know, is a trickster spider character. He's a character that in the folk tales really has no boundaries. He's able to do exactly as he pleases. He's highly sexed, he's outrageous, he's greedy, he's a liminal and amoral character. Anansi's roots can be traced back to the Ashanti of Ghana, as well as many other ethnic groups, but it was the Ashanti culture of Ghana that was the strongest in the Jamaican plantations. So those particular cultural forms were the ones that survived and influenced other cultural forms. So Ashanti culture is very strong in Jamaican culture still. In his Ashanti context, Anansi is a mediator between the world of mankind or humankind and the world of the gods. So he brings things down from the supreme being, Nyame, all sorts of things. They can be stories, they could be wisdom, great things. He does this inadvertently through a trick normally, or bad things like diseases and serpents. And he can do outrageous things. He can break his penis off into 12 pieces and impregnate 12 different daughters of Nyame. So he does things that in a tightly structured society, people would never even dream of thinking about. Yet through the medium of an Anansi story, and Anansi stories were told in group settings. You see a picture here of a group sitting down, listening, ready for a story. Anansi functions as a sort of vehicle of fantasy, so that you can escape from the tight structures of your society, of a compliant society, in the imagination. You would never do as Anansi does, but you can take these flights of fantasy, which inevitably then lead to a more structured society, because that society has let off steam through the imagination. Next slide. Now, when we move over into Jamaica and looking at the Anansi stories in Jamaica, we see many elements of plantation life creep into the stories. So instead of tricking the sky god Nyame, Anansi is tricking Massa. He's tricking the white man. He's wanting to get more sheep. He's wanting to sleep with Massa's daughter. He's wanting to steal from Massa's provision ground. So the stories start to symbolize the human condition of the enslaved, and they become filled with all sorts of strategies of survival. So my argument is that these strategies of survival were carried out at a psychological level. So the story is actually being told in the evening after the plantation, a day of work on a plantation, formed a type of psychological resistance, but which then also turned into methods of practical resistance, burning the cane fields, working more slowly, rubbing salt into old wounds, breaking machinery, all sorts of lying. So because Anansi has a silver tongue, he's a master storyteller. So being able to be linguistically dexterous, being able to use language to outmaneuver your oppressors is key to these trickster stories. So enslaved people would draw from Anansi stories as a resource, as a strategy of resistance. And those small practical methods of resistance that took place throughout the plantation period would then often lead into much bigger revolutions and revolts, and let's not forget that enslaved people brought about their own emancipation through these continual revolutions and revolts in the Caribbean. Next slide. So we see, this is an Anansi story from West Africa, where we see how Anansi brings wisdom into the tribe inadvertently through breaking a pot. So these are stories more about how things came to be, whereas the stories that we find in the Caribbean are much more about how to gain more, how to outwit larger, more powerful animals as a small creature, using your brains rather than your brawn. Next slide. In this image here, we see the different forms that Anansi takes. So what we find is depictions amongst the Ashanti. We see Anansi very much as a spider, but as he becomes emblematic of the human condition of the enslaved, he becomes depicted far more like a man. And so he takes on these human elements. Next slide. So Anansi tales persisted throughout the period of enslavement, and they were a way of continually resisting the system from within the system. And then going to Jamaica today, and I've done quite a bit of fieldwork in Jamaica, see that Anansi is still seen as one of the heroes of resistance. If everybody knows an Anansi story, so he's alive and well in Jamaica today. You ask people, can you tell me a bit about Anansi? And I always have a story for you, and I'll always find the story still incredibly funny, because let's not forget that one of the great things about Anansi is that the stories are humorous in that way, that they are entertaining. So they're violent, they're anarchic, but there are also a lot of humor in the stories. Next slide. I went to see the maroon abeng blower in Moortown when I was in Jamaica. And the Maroons, as you'll know, were escaped enslaved people that caused such a problem to the British that they eventually were granted their independence. They live up in the hills above the city, above Kingston, and their culture has managed to survive independently. So we find amongst the Maroons in these still isolated communities, Anansi stories that are closer to their Ashanti Ghanaian counterparts than Anansi stories found elsewhere on the island. This is Mr. Bernard. He was an abeng blower. Amongst the Maroons, the abeng blower is the person who blows a horn. This is an animal horn to warn of oncoming danger. So it'd often be, if the British army were coming or the invaders were coming, they'd blow the abeng. But the abeng blower also holds a very important spiritual position within the Maroon society. Next slide. So Mr. Bernard was able to tell me about Anansi. He says that the tricks that Anansi plays are also the tricks that the Maroons played. That is the plan of the Maroon, he said. These tricks of Anansi. Now you're coming for a little Anansi story, but you're gaining bigger than that, because you wanted to know how Anansi started to talk his story through we Maroon. We get in a bush and we ambush, and if anyone passing through, we scare them right there. And in my book, Anansi's Journey, I show how the Anansi tactics were used by the Maroons to evade the English in all sorts of surreptitious ways. Next slide. So we could connect the idea of the psychological resistance to enslavement and oppression to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's ideas in decolonizing the mind. And I believe that these oral storytelling traditions, if still taught to children, if children are still able to keep the traditions alive, form a part of that toolbox needed to decolonize the mind in the contemporary period. And they're not only instill a sense of pride in Black history, but also show that there was no such thing as a subservient slave. There was not a slave enslaved people did not accept the conditions of their enslavement. And that reality is embedded in all of their different cultural forms, in music, in song, in dance, in carnival, and in storytelling in particular. Next slide. This is Brother Martin. Brother Martin lived in Trenchtown, and one of my other interviewees, and he was a master storyteller in Kingston. And he said, the story teach you wisdom, it teach you knowledge, and it teach you understanding. You're supposed to pick the truth out of what Anansi say. One moment, sorry, I'm just. You're supposed to pick the truth out of what Anansi say. You're supposed to pick out the knowledge and the sense of it to put yourself on the right track. Anansi will say, jump in a hole, but you don't do that if you can't see what's down there. You have to understand the generalship. You have to work it out in your brain, and you have to understand the history. So there was a call to ban Anansi in schools in Jamaica in the 90s. But the generalship means tricksterism. And there's been a lot of pushback amongst religious institutions saying that Anansi actually characterizes the bad man or the gunman or the gangster who will do anything to get his own way. But what Brother Martin is telling us here is that actually these, just as they did in the African context, are stories which want people to make their own judgment about who they should follow within the story. So you don't always do as Anansi does. It can tell you, don't be the dupe, don't be the possum. But you don't need to actually align yourself always with what Anansi does. You need to maybe be wary of other Anansis. So you have to see the generalship, and you pick the knowledge and the sense out of it. So thinking back to the paper by Rachael, and thinking about the formation of childhood identity, these are actually stories which allow children to make their own moral choices within the tale. There's no Aesop's fable, explanation of like, this is bad, this is good. They're amoral stories in the sense that they cannot be understood in a Christian framework. They're understood in a framework in which there are not these strong binary oppositions. And we see that very much embedded in traditional African religious and spiritual thought. Next slide. So thinking a little bit about Anansi in the contemporary period, we'll see these trickster symbols and trickster figures are an obsession of young people, and found everywhere in cartoons, in stories, whether it's a Pink Panther, Bugs Bunny, which we can trace back to Bre'r Rabbit, Bart Simpson, even Tinkerbell, Puss in Boots. We are fascinated by trickster figures. One of the reasons we're fascinated is because the trickster can do things which we as human beings are not allowed to do. So through the medium of the trickster, we can fantasize about breaking all the boundaries that society places upon us. So, and they're also funny, but we are drawn to these figures, and they seep into our contemporary world. Next slide. So we see Anansi figured in American Gods. Some of you will be familiar with American Gods, and the Mr. Anansi figure played by Neil Gaiman, written by Neil Gaiman. And an interesting, I think very interesting, I don't want to go into too much detail, is that the Anansi character in Neil Gaiman's American God was played by an actor called Orlando Jones, who ended up writing his own script for the Anansi character, and it became, I'd love you to go away and watch the YouTube clip of Mr. Anansi talking to enslaved people on a slave ship, because Mr. Anansi tells the enslaved people that they are going to have 300 more years of suffering if they don't, he basically says, if you don't fucking free yourselves now, this is the bullshit you're going to have to put up for the next 300 years. And the enslaved, they break away, they break their chains, and they set the boat on fire. And it's a really powerful scene. Now, Orlando Jones was quite soon sacked and from the series. And there's a really interesting interview where he says that the producers thought that he represented the wrong kind of Black anger. So even now, that sort of that resistance, that those strategies of resistance that are necessary in Black cultures are still, are suppressed by white culture. Next slide. So the wrong kind of Black rage, and those are the links to Orlando Bloom's interviews where he's talking about representing Anansi. Next slide. Now I'm just going to touch on how long have I got left? Sorry. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, still okay. Yeah, go on.
I've got
you have 4 minutes.
Okay, great. So my second book was about Bre'r Rabbit, and we've touched upon in Rachel's excellent presentation the Bre'r Rabbit figure. Now, Bre'r Rabbit has a very different cultural trajectory because, as Rachel mentioned, the white folklorist Joel Chandler Harris took up the Bre'r Rabbit stories and became famous writing these stories or rewriting these stories in the late 1800s. Now, Joel Chandler Harris, as Rachel's pointed out, was nostalgic for the old plantation. He even writes here, the memory of the old plantation the memory of the old plantation will remain green and gracious forever. What days they were, those days on the old plantation. How vividly you remember the slightest incident. How picturesque the panorama that passes before your mind's eye. The old plantation itself is gone, but the hand of time has woven about it the sweet suggestions of poetry and romance, memorials that neither death nor decay can destroy. So you can see, you know, Joel Chandler Harris is hungry, lamenting a time, you know, where Black people knew their place and there were benevolent masters. And so he creates a frame narrator in Uncle Remus, who is telling a little white boy the Bre'r Rabbit stories. And yes, he did try extremely hard to write them verbatim, and he did record the stories from formerly enslaved and enslaved people. So, you know, there was that conscious effort to record something. I won't get into his sort of the complexities of Joel Chandler Harris and what he was trying to do, but the Uncle Remus has a lot to answer for. Next slide. This is one of the early copies of the Uncle Remus stories, Folklore on the Old Plantation. And you can see there the depiction, you know, Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus is a man who is you know, satisfied with the conditions of his enslavement, especially in the Disney film. Next slide. An excellent book by Shirley Moody Turner. So she's an African-American folklorist who looks at Black folklore and the politics of racial representation. And she looks at how Black folklore was used in the United States as an ideological weapon. This is something that we don't find in the Caribbean. She says the rhetoric of folklore achieved currency in the political and legal discourse of segregation because it was easily translated into support for the separation of the Blacks, of the races and the inferior position of Black people. So the Black folklore was used as a resource during segregation to show how, you know, backward, how primitive, you know, how childlike African Americans were. So, and Joel Chandler Harris's work feeds into that ideological weapon in the context of the United States. Next slide. And this is as Rachel said, the Zippity Doo Dah movie that she watched as a child, Song of the South, and which is even more problematic. It was banned for a while. Interpretation of the Joel Chandler Harris Uncle Remus figure, who says, you know, everything is satisfactory. Actually sings, you know, everything is fine. You know, everything is fine on the plantation. He's a happy slave. Next slide. My book on the Bre'r Rabbit Trickster, I look at how African-American writers have incorporated the Bre'r Rabbit stories into their own work in the 20th and 21st century. So people like Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison, and in a way reclaimed the Bre'r Rabbit figure from the hands of Joel Chandler Harris. And infused it once again in America, you know, with this anarchic, resistant survival energy. So we find those depictions of the Bre'r Rabbit figure in Invisible Man and Tar Baby. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to end with this because it did actually cause me a great deal of pain, but I'm able to look at it now with some humour because I can't quite believe this happened. But I wrote an article about the Bre'r Rabbit stories because the more that I looked at the Bre'r Rabbit stories, the more similarities I found between Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. So I imagine you all know about Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit. Beatrix Potter lived in the Lakes District. She wrote children's books, and her most famous character is Peter Rabbit. And the more carefully you look at the Peter Rabbit stories, you realize that the plot, the language is African American. You know, Jemima Puddle Duck, he ran off lickety splickety to the old plantation. So that even the depictions, the pictures of Bre'r Rabbit, of Peter Rabbit in her book are very similar to the ones found in Joel Chandler Harris's work. So I found that Beatrix Potter had actually read the Joel Chandler Harris's stories and then illustrated them for fun. And that was the beginning of Peter Rabbit. She then used them as a framework and in many ways lifted the narratives into her own stories. And this was never acknowledged. And even in her diaries, she says, I am afraid of being caught copying. So there's quite sort of firm proof that she was anxious about this and that the stories have African origins and African American origins. Without acknowledgement, I argued that this leads into a very dangerous form of cultural appropriation of Black culture. And so it's time to acknowledge it in the Beatrix Potter experiences, in the museum, in the amusement parks, with rides, Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit rides, in all the biographies, in the films, in the enormous, $1 million market of Peter Rabbit toys. We need some acknowledgement of this. And I wrote an article for The Conversation, a small, you'll know The Conversation, some of you, but it's an academic online journal. Then it was picked up by The Guardian, who did a very nice piece on it. And then all hell broke loose when the right-wing press got hold of it. Next slide. So then, so this is the Guardian piece that is based on my article, Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit story originating in African folk tales. Expert argues. Okay, very nicely done. Next slide. And then we have Daily Mail. Why the academic accusing Beatrix Potter of stealing Peter Rabbit from a slave fable needs a good lie down. And I thought, I do need a bloody good lie down after reading the rubbish you've written here. Beatrix Potter is accused of cultural appropriation by the academic, claiming her most popular stories, such as Peter Rabbit, were more than inspired by folk tales. And then now, GB News, now Peter Rabbit is under threat from woke mob as Beatrix Potter attacked. Next slide. Don't cancel Beatrix Potter. The culture police have come for Beatrix Potter. And it's a crime. So it went on and on. It was on CNN. It was on Fox News. It was in the States. I had endless requests to do media interviews. I turned them down. My university told me that you kind of feed the hate machine if you continue with it. And I want to try and make this into a radio program. Or maybe I'm working with Sky Arts to perhaps turn this into a documentary. But what it showed me, and I got so many racist, sexist emails to my email account that my email address had to be taken offline. But what it showed me, next slide, please. What it showed me is that there is still such a fear in the UK of this idea that something which is British and white is being blackwashed and taken over by the other. Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit is seen as a quintessential English story born in the Lake District, with all these sort of beautiful images of like the rolling English countryside. So to say that these are African stories, it touched a nerve. My theory of folklore is that it is in a continual process of adaptation and transformation. We need to acknowledge the roots, we need to acknowledge the sources, but we can change them and we can take them and we can readapt them. They exist in a perpetual stream of transformation, always being adapted to suit the needs of the tellers. So it's the people that tell the stories that can bend and shape Bre'r Rabbit and Anansi to their needs in the here and now. And I'm just and I'm ending with this slide which shows one of my friends at Leeds West Indian Carnival, because we have a big carnival here, taking Anansi on the road, with his own interpretation of this fantastic trickster figure as a symbol of resistance, but also celebration of Black culture in Carnival. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That's very interesting about Peter Rabbit things and everything. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so last speaker is the Dr. Winsome Monica Minott. She's a brilliant award-winning poet from Jamaica and the author of the two collection of poetry, Kumina Queen and Sion Roses. So please have a look at her bio for the list of her other publications and accolades. I know Winsome because she has done her PhD at my university, University of Kent, and she has been amazing for bringing Caribbean writers and organize events at our university. And this panel actually was a result of the conversation I had with Winsome. So thank you for Winsome. And another thing is that the image of the blue image of the spider, which I used for this conference, is her daughters. And Mr. Stephanie Thomas. So yeah, thank you so much for that one as well. Okay, so Winsome, would you like to start?
Thank you, Kel, for inviting me to participate. And first of all, I must say I am so thrilled to hear what you just presented, Emily, and thank you, Rachel, because I'm actually going to be the storyteller today rather than the academic. But sufficient to say that what you have discussed, what you've presented, bears true for what I am going to do, because I am actually adapting the stories of the past. I am actually moving it along into the Anansi, into the 21st century. So I am now, and I even asked myself the question, if Caribbean people have the right to even use the African stories. So that's one of the questions I wanted to have discussed with the panel today, because I really believe that, knowledge and stories are very fluid, but some people believe that there's a line that is crossed, and knowledge and culture may be appropriated by persons who have not got the right to use them. I don't know if there is any such person that doesn't have the right, but they need to acknowledge. What I think they have to do is acknowledge the source. So that's my perspective on it. I believe that in my story, I'm just going to be presenting a story, but I'm looking for you to look out for, the changes that I'm making, especially the use of language, which is intentional, the use of words in like how I'm using Black as against what persons would use Black for in the past, and what Black represents. Because again, coming from what Emily just discussed, a lot of the images that we have accepted and a lot of the cultural resonances that we accept have been influenced by European values. So although it is that Anansi and Lukkee, which I'll introduce later, Lukkee, I must confess that Lukkee is the one who reintroduced Anansi to me. He is a fantastic filmmaker, but I'm not going to digress. And I started looking at Anansi again, and I saw that this was a particular interesting storytelling opportunity, because I think that Anansi had this, over time, become a negative stereotyping way of, but it's all coming because of how it is Europeans saw Africa. So everything, there's a thing that says everything that comes from Africa or everything Black no good. These are some of the things that we hear daily in the Caribbean, and especially as children. So you grow up with these sort of negative feeling about things that come from Africa. And I can even say this, my mom, who was mixed, she didn't want to hear anything about Africa. She didn't want us to wear Afro because Afro is African, the older generation, they had this image that Africa was this place not to be welcomed at all in anything we are doing, and it's a fear, and it's coming back from slavery and how it is that persons had to live as slaves. So anything that is associated with a life of a slave, they need to reject it, and that is really what happened then. And that's why education is so important. Knowledge is so important. Language is so important. And having been exposed to all of this new learning, I believe it is incumbent on persons who have this knowledge to push back against these false teaching. And that's what my stories, what my poems, all of that, that I am trying to do as I go forward. So is there anything else that I need to say before I start? The next thing I would say is that Anansi, in my stories, because what I have done is I have 7 short chapters which will make one book. Actually, I wrote these stories 10 years or so ago. At the time, I think I was speaking with Lukkee. I wrote them and I sent them off to a publisher, and they were very interested in publishing them, but they wanted me to refine them, and I never worked on them after that. So it's when I met Kaori again, and she's into fables and stuff, that I told her about the stories, and I became interested again in them. So I have been working a little on them, but now that I have time again, I think I will go back and focus on them some and bring it together. Hopefully the publisher in Jamaica, because it's a Jamaican publisher that invited me to submit it, they may still be interested. So here goes. The Travels of Anansi. Anansi rubbed his head. I certainly put my foot in my mouth this time. As a matter of fact, all 8 of them, he said. His friends laughed at him. They were sure they got him this time. These friends were not really friends because they got together to stop what they call Anansi's lucky run. Always Anansi got the better of them. So tell me, Anansi, how you going to manage travel to 5 countries in 7 months to win this bet? Brother Rabbit asked. Brother Rabbit was a friend of Brother Mongoose. Delivering a parting shot, Anansi said, "Seeing is believing." Anansi had put a brave face on, although he was deeply troubled. Lord, if me lose the bet, me going have to work for 2 whole year planting yam and cocoa in this Jamaican hot sun for Brother Mongoose. The thought made Anansi shudder, but Anansi was honorable. Tricky, yes, but a survivor who uses his wit to overcome. Anansi muttered to himself, a bet is a bet. The only way out of it is to win it. For the next couple of days, Anansi was not his usual friendly self. Pato, the wise owl, knew something was wrong. Anansi, is what troubling you? Pato asked. Not a smile crossed your face for 3 whole days, but Pato already knew what was wrong. I have a reminder for you, Anansi. When trouble take you, fitness should fit you. The answer is always near you or inside of you. Anansi brightened. Pato now saw a twinkle in Anansi's eyes. One thing about Anansi, he could take a hint. The next morning, Anansi decided to go from house to house to listen for the answer. As he moved from rooftop to rooftop, he remembered a good bit of advice he got from Grandpa Anansi. In every story, find a gem. Always be on the lookout. Grandpa Anansi was the one who told him what would happen in the future. That is how one day he would be able to change from spider to a man and back. It was the only African secret that Grandpa Anansi carried with him to the Caribbean. But Anansi said he can't talk about it more than one time in his entire life, or the gift will come to an end. The secret resided with 3 other senior Ananses. Should any holder of the secret die, the gift passed to the firstborn. His third stop was at the house of Bre'r Parrot. Bre'r Parrot was wearing a green political shirt. Yet his wife wore an orange shirt and was a staunch supporter of the political party that today forms the opposition. The answer should be in this house, Anansi mused, because between them, they know everything that are going. I always hear that they take plane like how regular people take bus. Another of Grandpa's Anansi's wisest saying came to him. Avoid politician. Politics take too much time and nothing never change. But as luck would have it, as Anansi was just about to leave, he heard Bre'r Parrot making plans for his next trip. He was going to Beijing. Anansi climbed down, wanting to hear every word. Yes, Bre'r Parrot said, speaking on the phone to Baldhead Chicky, who managed one-stop travel agency. I need a ticket to Beijing. I want to leave in 5 days. What? $340,000? The price of the ticket shocked Anansi. He fell from the chair top on which he was perched. How can I ever afford this ticket? Is that the best price? Bre'r Parrot asked. I know the dollar slided, but anyway, book it for me now. Business is business. I'll have to put up the selling price again. Bre'r Parrot said, as if he was speaking to himself. Everything mashed up now, Anansi said. I have to find a plan B. Maybe I could fake it. Who will know that I don't really go anywhere? After all, this is a technology age. Everything available on the internet. So Anansi decided to browse the internet and sign up on Facebook. Here he could find all the information he needed. He'd learn about Paris, Rome, Belgium, Beijing, Singapore, USA, Argentina, Belize, Australia. This will impress my so-called friends, Anansi smiled for the first time in 5 days. Anansi's cunning was well known. He would stop at nothing to win. Later that evening, Anansi discussed his predicament with Mrs. Anansi and told her of his plans to visit 5 countries via the internet to win the bet. Not stupid. Stupid at all. They will want proof of your travels, said Mrs. Anansi. Anansi rubbed his head again. Anansi visited Bre'r Parrot's house each day. One morning, Bre'r Parrot took down a very large suitcase and Anansi stood on the roof watching him. An idea clicked in its brain. Anansi decided to hide in Parrot's suitcase, like Brother Worm, the stowaway, who had found himself in Jamaica, having stowed away on a banana boat. If Worm can stow away, so can I, Anansi said. Anansi was convinced that he had to sign up on Facebook so he could show them when he got to the next destination. When Anansi realized that his plan could work, he set out for Brother Tukuma's house to have Tukuma, the only computer literate fellow in the district, sign him up on Facebook. Tukuma was a half-brother. He will help me with the right encouragement, Anansi said to himself. But even that was not going to be easy. The encouragement was 2 ripe East Indian mangoes from Brother Dog Mango Tree, which was topside Brother Worm's grocery shop. Now, Brother Dog had 2 bad cousins. They were not on the best terms with Anansi because of that mango tree. So Anansi dropped word in the community and the rumor spread like fire. security company offering 100 US for all vicious dogs in the neighborhood. All wise dogs kept themselves out of sight, and Brother Dog was very wise. Anansi was able to secure 2 juicy East Indian mangoes. Takomo's eyes bulged at the sight of the mangoes and his mouth watered with delight. Me carry them for you, Takomo. You is good body. Takomo was so delighted with Anansi's generosity that he signed him up immediately on Facebook. Anansi was glad when he saw his face larger than life on Facebook. He wrote on his Facebook wall, Beijing, I soon come. Next Monday, Parrot paid his bills online and packed his suitcase. The clothing, shoes, medication, and books that Parrot packed left little room for the unexpected passenger. Anansi waited till Parrot was done before he sneaked in at the top corner of the suitcase. When Anansi heard Parrot telling his wife that he would call her in 23 hours when he arrived in Beijing, Anansi fainted. He was claustrophobic. The bet would have been off there and then, but Anansi was out cold. Anansi came out of his stupor some 12 hours later. When he peeked through the luggage, he realized he was in a strange place. The first sign he saw, Gatwick, London. And he exclaimed, I must update my Facebook page. Everybody back home must see my face. Yes, my black, smooth skin, silk and safe. But that was easier said than done. Anansi needed to find a helpful mate in the UK like Brother Takomo. Anansi was not giving up. He got an opportunity to crawl out the suitcase when Parrot went to freshen up. He immediately changed himself into a man. Anansi went up to the Virgin Atlantic airline counter and with tears running down his cheeks told the customer service agent that he had got separated from his friend, Mr. Parrot, who was a traveling buddy from the Caribbean. It's the first time I travel, you know, miss. And guess what? Parrot have all my papers and my clothes. Suddenly he stopped crying and said, oh, but I think I know how we can reach him. Parrot travel with this thing he called an iPad, and I sure he always roaming. If you sign me in on Facebook, I will send a message to all my friends. Someone will come looking for me. Just make me stand on the counter before that Virgin sign right beside you. The sympathetic agent signed in and allowed Anansi to pose beside her. Anansi posted this message. I'm here in London, sending greeting to all of your folks back home and all of the family in the UK. Please come get me. I is here. Anansi had a broad smile, his black, beautiful heart beating fast, fast. He thanked the counter agent. She had done good by him. His smile made the agent suspicious, but before she could ask any question, Anansi disappeared. A little voice whispered, it is in the goodness that you, Anansi, sowed over all the years that now will come back to you. Anansi remembered what Grandpa Anansi always said, if you plant grass, grass will grow. 4 more countries to go, Anansi thought to himself. End of chapter. So yeah, I have 7 chapters, and it is where the countries he went and how he got there, and eventually, of course, he won the bet. So this is, I think, a good illustration of transforming what was old into more modern day society, and also still trying to have some humor in it while you are actually it's a teaching moment for children, the overcoming spirit of the Africans, the persons who had not just to survive, but they had to overcome. And it is that, to me, is the most vital message that we can teach any Caribbean child, that there is so much that we still need to overcome. Because as Emily just pointed out, that the backlash that she is suffering from is something that I think all Caribbean persons of, if you try to stand up against what is supposed to be acceptable to Europeans, especially if you are doing it as a person challenging their authority, you'll always have this backlash. So it is for us to understand that as Caribbean people, that we are still fighting and we're willing to fight, and we will always fight and we will always overcome. So that is my message in my stories. And I am always willing to fight, as you know, Kaori. Yeah, so basically, my stories are a bit of what I've experienced as well in life and what I've seen. And I suppose I'm trying to put everything in one pot and have a mixing pot, and come out with a gem, something that persons can hold on to, persons can understand. Because I think what has happened, a lot of people do not understand the Black experience. And because of that, they do not know the sufferings that Black people have gone through. And because of that, they believe that, oh, slavery is over. Why are you still worried about it? Why are you bothered by slavery? And for me, it is that there is generational pain. We have generational pain that we're carrying. And I'm trying to have other persons understand that it's not going to disappear because they want it to disappear. That it is something that we have to deal with as a whole, a people together, and try and find that healing point that they can understand us and we can understand them. So that's what I have to say today. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, Winsome, would you like to introduce Luke?
Okay, right, Lukkee. Okay. Well, Lukkee, first of all, is my friend, I dare say. Lukkee Chong. He is this fantastic filmmaker hailing from Jamaica. He's now living in the United States of America, but Lukkee is one of these creatives that impacted my life really significantly. By the way, I was his chartered accountant. He had a firm, Frame by Frame, and that did a lot of work, including a feature program, Island Style. For how many years, Lukkee?
Over 10 goodness.
years?
About many? 10 years, a long time.
Over 10 years, a very long time. And he has this wonderful idea that I was hoping and still hope that will come to fruition about making a feature film. And also he introduced Anansi to me, because he is the one that said that Anansi is very misunderstood, and that got my attention. Yeah, it got my attention. So I started to read about Anansi and to find out for myself why Anansi is so misunderstood. So thank you, Lukkee. I hope one day we can still work together on something great.
I have not given up, Miss Winsome. And
Okay.
As a matter of fact, thank you and Kaori for introducing me to this August panel.
Yes, yes.
The presentations that I've heard here has sort of reinforced a lot of my thought processes, built over the years from relationships at JBC Television with Louise Bennett, who is Jamaica's foremost folklorist. She celebrated her 105th birthday last weekend. And I was part of that celebration here in Fort Lauderdale, as well as some in Kingston.
Yes.
Joan Andrew went and did flowers and so on at her grave at National Heroes Park in Kingston. And it was Louise that sort of it was my interactions with Luis Bennett as a cameraman at the Jamaica Broadcasting Television studios over years. I worked there for 12 years. And her program was Ring Ding was actually 12 years.
Okay.
I found that out. It was, anyway. So it was my interactions with her that created this interest in folklore. And when she left, the day of her last program, and she had to leave, and she had to leave Jamaica because she needed assistance, which Jamaica could not give her, which I thought was, I found that very painful.
Yeah.
Because to me, Louise Bennett, with her, with what she did at to the culture of Jamaica, her representation of the culture in Jamaica, and I'm talking about culture of the 1930s, 1940s in Jamaica, gave us as Jamaicans an identity which we carry today. There would not have been a Bob Marley or a Jimmy Cliff or a Usain Bolt without Louise Bennett.
Without Louise.
Right? So fast forward to Anansi and my interactions with others here in the diaspora, in particular, a couple, Menaya and her husband, Dr. Robert Vassell, who are very Afrocentric Jamaicans, but they travel to Ghana every year. Now they go every July, and they're the ones, they're the African spiritualists, okay? And they are the ones who sort of reinforced my Anansi foundation in conversations with them. I'm told, from their own experiences and their own spirituality, who and what Anansi is. And so when a young Padawan approached me about, Lukkee, why don't we get involved with doing video games? I said, Adrian, I don't know anything about video games. I don't know how to make video games, right? So what about us doing some animation of Anansi stories? And this goes back to the early mid 2000s. So it's been a while, Winsome.
Yes, I know.
And eventually, I started funding the effort, and he gave a lot of his time, and eventually we put together a team, and we wrote 8 stories, painfully, because we did not know how to write these things, and we never had a foundational message direction in which we really wanted to go. We were just recreating Anansi's stories for the sake of recreating Anansi's stories. However, going through that process and seeing the social conditions of young Black people in the world today, not just Jamaica, but globally, especially here in the diaspora as well. I came to the conclusion as head cook bottle washer that these stories need to have a purpose.
Yeah.
And, I think Anansi's origins dictated that these stories have a purpose. And so I am not happy with where we are today, today with what I have done with Anansi, and Anansi, being Anansi, will find a way to get things done, Winsome. So we're not giving up.
Right. Well, this is the beginning again, Lukkee.
Exactly. And with the contributions I've heard here from both from Rachael and Emily, and you guys are going to get enlisted one way or another to continue the evolution of Anansi. And Emily referred to American Gods, or Gods of America. I can't remember what it's called. But season 1, episode 2, the first 10 minutes should be priority viewing for this group if they're interested in Anansi. American Gods, season 1, episode 2, first 10 minutes or so. You can stop after that if you want to. But that first 10 minutes was very pivotal in my thought processes as well. And I'm very glad to hear the background, Emily, of that character, the actor. And I'm going to go do some more research on him as well. But yeah, thank you guys. Two of the animations are online. They're too long and the endings are wrong. They're not what I want them to be. My ambition is to use them as a bit of social engineering or re-engineering, social engineering, because I think we have to start very young to re-socialize our society, right? And yes, I'm doing that, and I'm not gonna feel bad about doing it either. Okay, because I think it needs to be done. Thank you guys for including me. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, wow. I did not, yeah, you sent me the picture of the Leeds Beckett, but I did not realize you were the camera. It's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. So I think that everybody, like all the speakers try to kind of think the way to reinvent that, the Tricksters figures. And I'm sure you must have a question to each other. Yeah, to ask. How would you like to start?
Emily, what's the name of your book? The one on Anansi?
So it's called Anansi's Journey, a story of Jamaican cultural resistance. And it's published by UWI,
Really? Okay.
University of the West Indies Press.
Anansi's Journey. Okay.
Yes. But yeah, thank you. I love hearing about your work, and I'm going to check out your animations. I worked with Ted to create an animation which looks at the story of Anansi. It's a 3-minute animation, and so I wasn't the animator. I provided the story, but it took about a year to do, and it was really complex actually because first of all the Ananses and the characters were always, all the animations tended to be like, they looked like Smurfs, and you had enslaved people on the plantation, with these long eyelashes and all pretty, and it didn't, the characters looked really cute and Disney-like, and it didn't work. And Nancy looked cute and Disney-like. So I just kept pushing back. I said, I wanted to have an African, a West African animator or a Caribbean animator, and then they didn't have a voice actor who could do an African, West African or Caribbean accent. They said on their payroll they had nobody they could do it. So wow. It was a big fight, and I think they probably will say she's a right pain in the ass. But in the end, it's TED Ed, and if you Google Anansi TED Ed, there's the animation there, and I'm quite pleased with it. And now it's nicely done. And then I did another talk, a TEDx talk as well on Anansi. And so there's, and what was nice about doing the TEDx talk is that people who watched it, a lot of people in West Africa watched it, and in the Caribbean, and saying it's really wonderful to see our history being platformed here.
Absolutely. I hope you don't think my characters are too Disney.
No, not at all. Your characters are thinking they're not in any shape or form. That's exactly the sort of thing. When it's something, like a bit that breaks up the norm, that's what we need, and it represents the spirit of Jamaica or Ghana.
I'm teasing you.
Yeah. But I'm British, so I'm always going to be terribly polite. So I had a question I was going to ask Rachel, is about the fascinating talking about the works progress administration interviews, and I saw some of them myself when I went to the Library of Folklife in Washington DC, which was a great resource on Bre'r Rabbit stories. But I really like what you were saying about how the interviews took place during the Great Depression, and food was scarce for Black Americans there. So did you were you able to pinpoint where the stories reflected the scarcity of food in the here and now for those storytellers? Or was that quite hard to decipher? I guess you could tell with the food types, perhaps.
Yes, it's difficult in the sense of looking at food types across the US South, which of course encompasses Kentucky and other areas. So there's big differences in the animals that people would eat. The narratives, and you've probably found this too, the interviews are very, very rich in Georgia and South Carolina. Texas also has a large collection. But in answer to that question, I would say I don't know, which is not the best answer to give. What I would say is that the animals that are referred to, not necessarily for eating, for instance, but the animals that are referred to definitely is based on geography. And so, for instance, you might see references to, and this also comes in some of the autobiographies by former enslaved persons, but seeing references, for instance, to large spotted cats as far as Louisiana. It depends on the time period. And so part of my research looks at, deforestation and such. And they're referring to ocelots. And ocelots now kind of relegated in very small numbers to Arizona and a very small part of Texas, New Mexico. We also see stories, especially from North Carolina, Virginia regions, about mountain cats and cougars. And so a large part of my research looks at how people from Africa, when they came over, placed certain beliefs, values, and such norms with which they were accustomed regarding various animals, and placed these onto or carried over these beliefs to animals that were the nearest in characteristics or appearance to those in and across Africa. And so one example of that would be the ocelot, but the mountain lion, the cougar in a US context is a brilliant example. And that's where we see geography coming into play. Now, on the other end, when I'm looking at Africa, for instance, geography also comes into play, because an intervention that I make, and maybe this is going off on too much of a tangent, but the intervention that I make is we all very often look at West Africa and West Central Africa as not being as connected. People will speak of West African cultures in the Americas, Central West African cultures. I think when we're looking at animals, and this is across the Americas and in the US, we need to look at ecosystems. And so we know that a large number of enslaved people to the United States did come from West Africa. A lot of people would think, well, there weren't leopards in West Africa in the 1700s, 1800s. There weren't lions. So how could they look at and draw these links and similarities between, for instance, a lion and a mountain lion in the US? Well, they could, because the different ecosystems across Senegal, where I lived, Senegambia region, and a little bit further south, this was grassland. It still is. Its ecosystem is grasslands and savanna grasslands and such. Whereas you also have rainforest in contemporary regions, Ghana and such, in addition to West Central Africa. So when I look, I've not meant to twist your comment about geography, for instance, but I see geography coming into play with respect to belief systems placed onto animals. So with respect to food, I would just say possums was sort of omnipresent, but bringing in, for example, roles of different persons on and in these slave plantations. There's a story in one of the interviews that looks at a little child who was allowed to adopt a bear cub because the mother was killed by his uncle, and he's allowed to adopt this bear cub and he takes it home. Well, this is not in Texas. It's much more in the north of the contemporary US South. And so he doesn't eat the bear, but it teaches us about roles of parenthood and his uncle and being allowed to keep this animal and look after it until the animal then starts to destroy the slave cabin and relegated back into the wild. But I don't have accounts of people, for instance, eating bear meat, eating cougars and stuff, just that they saw these animals.
Thank you, Rachel. I've always thought it was fascinating looking at the Ashanti Anansi tales in Ghana, where there's a lot of references to an elephant, and the elephant plays a role in particular stories where he's often duped by Anansi, and Anansi shaves off part of his behind and eats it. And then when in the Jamaican stories, you have this very similar plot line, but it seems that people telling the stories have forgotten what the elephant was, and he becomes Big Skin Ting. So the elephant's name is replaced with the name Big Skin Ting. Yeah, which I think is brilliant.
It could almost be Big Sin Ting instead of Big Skin Ting.
Yeah, Big Skin Ting.
So I would actually like to connect and talk about this, because this is, I guess, one of the advantages of being a comparative historian looking at Brazil and Cuba in addition to the US. And in Brazil, when I mentioned about the Vasouras region, during the time that the Works Progress Administration interviews were collected, we also have examples of riddles, jongo as they were called, play on word, and it comes from a Bantu-rooted language in Central West Africa. And one of them that I use a lot has the word jamba in. So any of you who are in the US, jamba juice, or if you've been to the US, it's kind of like a smoothie parlor or something. Well, I always think it's very, very funny, because in Bantu-rooted languages, jamba and other similar words, it means elephant. And so it shows us, with respect to time, Brazil did not abolish the transatlantic slave trade until the 1860s. So around 60 years after the United States. The journeys across the South Atlantic were very, very, they were a lot faster, and these ships were zipping across. And Brazil imported around 41% of enslaved persons during that time period of the transatlantic slave trade. In that sense, what's important is that when these people were interviewed in the 1930s, they were not necessarily in their 90s and 100. They were a lot younger. And we see these words. Another example is rabbit or hare. Kandimba is a word that is shared across many Bantu languages. And the interviews that were collected in Portuguese, when you look through them, the words just can't be translated into Portuguese, because it's a Central African word and it's rooted. And so I think that's very interesting, because when you mention an elephant, and in my research, I look at why an elephant, why are these people singing about an elephant? There's no similar elephant, megafauna in Brazil like that. But now listening to your connection and what you've just shared, is very, very fascinating, because it's another example of these stories coming over. And we know that people from West Africa also went to Brazil.
Yeah.
Large part, yes.
Yes. And I think, one of the reasons that we could, count for there being perhaps a stronger influence of West African religions in Jamaica is that the population of the enslaved did not, and it's a very crass word to use, but reproduce itself in the same as quickly as enslaved populations in the United States. So there's so many new enslaved people coming from Africa throughout the period of enslavement in Jamaica that are then bringing with them their cultural input and impacting on that cultural melee, whereas in the United States we have this a more stable population that's reproducing itself so we lose some of the that injection of African culture in the US. But I wanted to ask, I'm just going to ask Monica a question about the beautiful Anansi story that you've written there. I love it. and which is full of like the, you know, his Anansi's trickster energy, and it's that's chapter 1, isn't it?
Yes, chapter 1 out of 7, yeah.
And I was wondering, how are you negotiating with your character, like how much of a bad man Anansi is, you know, how much of a, are you like, how far will you push him, or are you just letting him take you on a journey?
I'm just letting it flow. What I think is that I believe Anansi will do what is necessary to succeed. However, I'm also saying that survival is important. If you don't survive, then you can never succeed. So for me, I want, and also I want to sort of embrace the hardship that, the planting coca and the yam, and so it's going back to when they had to be on the plantation. So you want to link the past with the present, but at the same time, I don't want him to be an outright bad person. You understand? Because that is the thing. I don't know, I haven't really done the work in terms of research in the African stories as you have both, maybe. And I don't know if the African stories really are showing Anansi as a bad person, because one of you mentioned that we don't have to adopt exactly what Anansi represents. But I'm thinking that has a European touch to it. I think that's what has happened. I think because of how we see ourselves, even if it's in Africa, because Europe, of course, went and this overtook everything that was African and made it theirs. They divided Africa into bits and pieces, and that's the problem we have. And also they brought their cultures and their thoughts with them. So even for African stories are colored, using the word specifically, by European thought. And I am careful to say that, because I believe that if it is that we see someone who has control of guns and weapons and can control us as being on a higher plane, then you absorb some of what they're thinking about you, and not realizing that the man with the might is not necessarily the man who is right, And I think that is where I would like to say that is a teaching that we need to try to transfer. So my stories, I want us to question, I want the children to question what is might and what is right. So that would be, if I have one line, that's what I would like. I want to question what is might and what is right.
Yeah, and that's perfect. I think that in the African, so in the Ghanaian context, the people that took down the stories in Twi in the Ashanti language were white colonialists. So one of the best collections we have is by R.S. Rattray, who was writing recording them in the 1930s. He was somebody who was sort of deeply engaged in the culture, but then he wrote in Twi, he recorded them in Twi and in English, but his colonial thinking will frame them.
Of course.
But I think he's more, I think Anansi in that context, though, he's not a bad man, because I think there's not such a definition between good and bad. He's simply a vehicle to absorb chaos into our world in a way which is creative. So from destruction comes creation. So Anansi brings things, he's the mediator between deities and mankind, and so that anarchic energy is necessary for creation. And then what I've noticed is in Jamaica that there's so many people like Louise Bennett are being constantly asked, but what about Anansi? He represents the gangster, how can you celebrate him? And Louise Bennett says, well, he exposes people's Achilles heel. He says that you shouldn't. He exposes the weaknesses, so don't be duped by an Anansi. But I think that you're right, Monica, that in a way they're being backed into a corner to having to say that.
I think no, you see, Louise also grew up in that time, like my mother, and so although she was very radical and she was embracing this newness of self, I don't believe we can escape it. That's it, you know. We are going to be marked by, we are brought up and we're taught a British curriculum if you are of a certain age and stage. So we are, you know, we have that whole British thinking if we have gone to high school and prep school. That is what we learn. So it is really a rebellious spirit that moves away from it. So I think most persons, even if you are rebelling, you still have, I call it, you've been tainted.
Yeah, for real.
I see Anansi as a very complex character, as Emily described him earlier, being the messenger from the gods to us mortals, and carrying the messages in various ways. Anansi being described as a trickster, right, was a means to an end for Anansi to achieve his goals. And his goals usually were feed his family, for him to succeed in whatever endeavor he was going to be doing. It didn't matter that you were anybody else or everybody who got in the way became a stepping stone. Like in your story, Winsome, you know, the attendant at the Virgin Atlantic desk became a pawn in Anansi's for Anansi to get to his goal, you know, and that is how I intend to try and continue to use the stories of Anansi for social reconstruction, right? That is how I would like to do it. And, you know, and I see you guys along here, you know, are going to become resources.
I think
Anansi stories.
Because there is a story where Anansi actually eats his family too.
Okay.
Oh my goodness.
So I guess it's all about it's all about the context.
His survival,
Exactly.
How hungry is he? How far you want to push it, but I'm not going in that direction. No, mine is definitely not going in that direction.
But I have a question for you, for the panel though. Who is Jack Mandora?
So there's lots of different interpretations of this, and because in the end of a lot of Anansi stories in Jamaica, people say Jack Mandora, me no choose none, which is, I will not choose to do what was Anansi did in this story. So one of the interpretations that I found was that Jack Mandora was the keeper of the gates of heaven. And so you tell Jack Mandora, I would not choose any of the things that Anansi has done because I still want to be able to be welcomed at the pearly gate. But then the other interpretation that I found was that it came from Jackanory. So there was a kind of British colonial a creolization of a British
of a word.
Word. So Jackanory, you know, was it Jackanory? Here's my story.
I think that is more it.
So that the word originates with the Jackanory story that turns into Jack Mandora.
I prefer the first interpretation. Keeper of Heaven's Gate. That's how I knew it as well. Actually, I was just seeking endorsement.
But if it is, and both of them are good, are nice kind of examples of creolization in action. Like take something and make it your own.
Exactly. As some hear it, as some give it. Jack Mandora, me not choose none. Because our stories are, you know, our history as Afro from the African diaspora, you know, it's an oral one. So as me hear it, some give it. Jack Mandora, me not choose none.
I think that is really the interpretation, you know, that you just said, Lukkee. That is like storytelling. So you're getting to it. And you're not
Yes.
choosing what you get or what you give. You give everything you get.
Mhm,
I think that
mhm.
is what I think that it fundamentally means.
Fascinating. We need to share this
Yeah.
with the next
But that was
generation.
from Louis
Yeah.
Bennett that I learned that saying.
Exactly.
Louis
Yeah,
Bennett.
I'm watching third and fourth generation Jamaican Americans on stage the other day, and I'm saying this is amazing, you know, and I'm hoping that we can keep the roots of our culture alive through this, you know, the next 3 or 4 generations, actually.
I
You know,
think it
here in
will.
America, here in the UK. I mean, I did high school in London, and I never heard any of this stuff.
Well, based on what
Shortish-
Rachel and
shortish-
Emily are doing, you can see that there's work being done.
Of course, very
Yeah.
encouraged.
Hey, thank you so much. So I have to wrap it now, but